Good morning, everyone, and thanks for being here today on this beautiful summer day. So, last week during the discussion, um, I, um, I think Becky alarmed us all by saying she was going to get rid of all of her books. There were a few takers who wanted to sort through them. So, I thought I'd start with something a little bit about that, since it does relate to what we're going to talk about today, the section of the Genjo Koan that we're going to discuss. So, there is another writing of Dogen Zenji that addresses just this point in a way. Now, this is from the Fukan Zazenji, Instructions on Zazen. You should therefore cease from practice based on intellectual understanding, pursuing words and following after speech, and learn the backward step that turns your light inward to illuminate yourself. And a little farther on in the same writing, Dogen says, why leave behind your proper place which exists right in your own home and wander aimlessly off to the dusty realms of other lands? So the reading today, the section we'll be discussing, this section of the Genjo Koan that we've been working our way through, is short. When you first seek the Dharma, you imagine that you are far away from its environs. But Dharma is already correctly transmitted. You are immediately your original self. When you first seek the Dharma, you imagine that you are far away from its environs. But Dharma is already correctly transmitted. You are immediately your original self. So, when you first seek the Dharma, what is that? When is that? When does that actually occur? That's open to a lot of interpretation, I think. I think it's at various points during one's life one gets the notion of seeking something more meaningful or something deeper than what would seem to be the everyday. Something more meaningful than getting good grades or getting a promotion or getting a paycheck. So there's that, and then there's the sense of seeking the Dharma in coming to a Buddhist practice. Somehow finding out about something about Buddhism and being drawn to it, being attracted to it, and wanting to learn more. And at first it seems very exotic and far away. And I think for a Westerner coming to Buddhism, the trappings of Buddhism kind of reinforce that view. There's people dressed in robes, colorful robes, and then there's all of the bells and the incense, the candles, and there's the exotic chanting in foreign languages that makes everything seem very far away, foreign, distant. It's kind of like we're striving for something that is over the rainbow somewhere. And so what Dogen says is, though, it seems like it's far away, but it's already correctly transmitted. You are immediately your original self. Original self. What does that mean? Well, Shohaku Okamura helps us some by going into the Chinese and Japanese, the Japanese character, the kanji, that is used for this original self. Or he looks at the parts of the Japanese words that form this concept of, or this translation of, original self. And in Japanese, again, I'll probably mispronounce this, but it's hanbun nen. And the han part, H-O-N, means original, or true, or root, or source. And the bun means part, or portion. And the nen refers to person. So you could translate this as a person playing his or her true part. Original self. This is a phrase that has a history, like many of the phrases that Dogen uses. And one of the first places this appears is in a story about one of the Zen ancestors, the so-called sixth patriarch, the sixth Zen ancestor in China, whose name in Japanese is Eno, E-N-O. And the story of Eno, to be very brief, is that he was an illiterate wood gatherer in a small village to the south. And he was in the process of gathering wood and taking it to the village. They would go into the forest, gather fallen wood, and bring it into the town to sell for people to use to make fires. And he was in the process, and he went into the village, and he heard just a phrase from the Diamond Sutra, and it completely overwhelmed him. He said, "I've got to know more." He said this to himself, and then he talked to the person who was reciting this phrase from the Diamond Sutra, and he found out that there was a monastery to the north, that there was a teacher who could teach more about the Diamond Sutra and other teachings. And so he left his home in order to find this teacher. So he went to the monastery, and he was arrived as kind of, he was considered kind of a Hoosier because he was illiterate and from the South, and so he was kind of low status, and they sort of put him to work. But the abbot at the monastery, the teacher there, perceived something, perceived a wisdom beyond his years in Eno, and cultivated that over time. And when it came time for the abbot to pass on the robe and bowl, in other words, to be succeeded by someone, there was a logical candidate, and that was a senior monk who had been there for years and years and always been reliable and just always was doing the right thing. And this monk was called Myo, M-Y-O. But the abbot did not want to succeed to Myo because he thought that there was something about Eno that would make him a better choice. But he realized that giving the succession to this newcomer, relative newcomer, who was sort of semi-literate, would cause strife in the monastery. So he gave the robe and bowl to Eno, but he told him to leave and go to another place and start his own monastery in another location. Well, of course, the other monks found out about this. In particular, Myo found out about this the next morning and went off in pursuit of Eno because he felt entitled. And he pursued him until he finally caught up with Eno miles away. And Eno was there kind of sleeping, sort of waking up, and his robe and bowl that he had been given were on the ground, and Myo approached him and said that he was really entitled to these things, not Eno. And he bent over and was going to take the robe and bowl and run off with it. But he tried to lift it, and he could not lift it. He could not move it. This is one of those sort of magical realism stories from Zen, where he could not move it. So he struggled and tried to take this, and Eno said to him just these words that have been sort of immortalized: "Think neither good nor evil. At this very moment, what is the original self of the monk Myo? Think neither good nor evil. At this very moment, what is the original self of the monk Myo?" And this absolutely stopped Myo in his tracks. He sort of broke out in a sweat, and he just stopped, stood there. And then he bowed to Eno and indicated that Eno would be his teacher. So original self. What is original self? And this may be confusing because in the prior passage, there was this bit about forgetting the self, and we talked about forgetting or discarding the self. So now we're talking about original self. So how do we bring these together? So that's a point for discussion. But before we get into that, I wanted to introduce just two other translations of this same passage to illustrate how it has different perspectives depending on how one understands it and perceives it and translates it and tries to bring it into English. And this is a translation by David Brazier, who spoke at Heartland Zen a few weeks ago from his home in France through the miracle of the internet. If, when a beginner seeks the Dharma, he or she positions him or herself as far away and nowhere near the Dharma's edge, then when the Dharma is correctly transmitted, he or she is soon playing her part like a natural. So instead of saying that the Dharma is already correctly transmitted, he's talking about it being translated at some point in time where it is transmitted to the person, allowing the person to play his or her part like a natural. And natural, of course, comes from the Latin natus, or meaning birth. So it's like something you're born with. So that's his take on this concept of original self. Playing one's part like a natural. And finally, a translation by Paul Jaffe. When a person starts to search out the Dharma, he separates himself far from the Dharma. When the Dharma has already been rightly transmitted in oneself, just then one is one's original self. When a person starts to search out the Dharma, he or she separates him or herself far from the Dharma. But when the Dharma has already rightly been transmitted in oneself, then one is one's original self. So to me, this when reading this passage, I kept for some reason coming up with this with quotes from The Wizard of Oz. So at first it's seems like it's somewhere over the rainbow, and then at the end of the story, it's, "Oh, Auntie M, there's no place like home." So in a way, these two sentences are almost like a homecoming story, like almost like the prodigal son story. The thinking that what you're searching for is far, far away, and finding that it is right here. And how one goes through that transformation is, I think, mysterious, and people have different takes on it, as can be reflected by the different translations that I read. So there's something about the understanding of self that Dogen is talking about here. And it's not as simple as no self. Self doesn't exist. It's also not as simple as the usual self that we perceive in the world, separate from everything else, struggling to survive. But there is another way of looking at things that Dogen is trying again and again through these passages to transmit to us. So I think I'll stop there, and maybe we can discuss this concept of original self, this concept of coming home. Home's an interesting word, by the way. I'll just mention this before we break into groups. It has a Germanic derivation or origin. And it's it doesn't really, there isn't a sort of a non-Germanic derived word in at least Indo-European languages that strictly corresponds to it. There are lots of words for house, but the concept of home, coming home, seems to be special. So I think we'll break into groups, and what about this maybe struck you or resonated or didn't? Thank you for listening.
Could I ask a quick question first?
Oh, please.
In the first translation, there was the word immediately. I'm curious if you are able to elaborate upon that at all.
Immediately. Well, this may be a good thing for discussion in the groups as well. It sounds like immediate can mean sort of in time and space, can't it?
Or perhaps something else as well.
Yeah. It can be immediate, like it's immediate, it's here. It can also be immediate, like sudden. Like all of a sudden one's perspective can change. So I'm glad you brought that up, Elliot, and we'll allow that to feed the discussions as well, and come back together in a few minutes. Thank you.